as a union and not something artificial. What do you?
Well, my compromise is to do translations from Urdu. I did Penguin Book of Modern Urdu Poetry for that purpose. It's one way of, because to some extent I am bilingual, very bilingual, I would say. By translating, I get to the roots of my own self. And I enjoy Urdu poetry in spite of the fact that I write poetry in English. I enjoy Urdu poetry more because somehow it connects to something much deeper in me. Because I happen to be bilingual. But there are people who have been just brought up on English language and they have to express their experiences in English. I must say, I have not come across that great novel about Pakistan yet. It might come at some point, but at the moment there have been some good novels and writers, etc. But nobody has been able to do a Gunter Grass or a Marquez on Pakistan. And I think that novel has to come in Urdu somehow, but it could come in English also,
What about, there are those who would argue that A Case of Exploding Mangoes is that novel. And it is telling, of course, that it's written by someone whose first language is Urdu and who doesn't come from the same background as with most of the other writers. And there are people who say maybe that is the great novel of a certain time. You wouldn't agree?
Yes, it is. But if the people for whom it's written are hardly able to read it, it can't have that kind of impact. That's one of the big things I know readership is very small even in Urdu. Probably English novels published in Pakistan sell more in Pakistan than even Urdu novels. I don't know the facts. But the great novel has to come from a whole culture and a people who then begin to read it and to look in it a vision of their society, of hope, of fear, of whatever. If it's written in English, no matter how great it is, and if the 90% of people cannot, well, it could be translated, yes, in Urdu, but I'm saying that these are moments in history where great novels are written. They are written within a particular culture, and they are then taken up by almost all the, let's say, literate people in that kind of environment, either directly or indirectly. And for that to happen in Pakistan, I feel, I may be wrong, that the great novel will have to be in Urdu, or in some other language. But in English, it's difficult, I think.
Of course, if it's in Urdu, will we define it as the great novel is the question as well? Because won't it be about, again, going back to the market and the audience, if it's the global audience we're looking at, unless that Urdu novel is translated then into the global languages, would we be able to consider it the great novel? Because we do have some fantastic Urdu writers around, as you know quite well. And that, in which case I do want to ask that do symbols, it's very hard sometimes to translate symbols in different cultures. And when you do translate from one language to another, the whole concept of getting lost in translation, but that's the only way we can study world literature. Otherwise
Oh no, I'm not knocking translation, because
No, of course you're not.
all the great
Yes.
Russian novels
Yes.
that we read were in one translation or another, because not many of us speak Russian or read Russian. But they are the greatest novels the world has ever produced, and we learn from them, and we learn and the message is conveyed. But they were originally written in Russian, not in French,
Yes, not everyone's Nabokov who can write in many different languages at the same time. But that does, I think, lead to that interesting question again, that in Urdu, yes, it would probably be someone who is speaking for the Pakistani audience. In English, we get the criticism that it's within the small bubble of only English-speaking people. And just coming back to something Anya was saying about politics and the relation with the place, it could possibly also be perhaps because if you look at Pakistan and Pakistani culture and you're here right now, it's in the air we breathe. And it may not be so, as you were saying about European writing. Is that possibly why there's less of it?
I suppose so, yeah. I suppose the point of view concerning politics in Europe is mostly not that sophisticated or not as broad. And maybe people would talk about European politics and some laws which change, and there's always the globalization problem, and there's always the market, but it somehow remains abstract. And I think as it remains that abstract, people are not really able to talk about it. And here the confrontation is more real in a way. So I think yes, and I feel that in Europe sometimes it's as the informations are sort of vast for a lot of people, it also scares them, and so it might also be a reason why they require stories which do not which sort of take place in a more settled field, and which I think is strange nowadays, but that might be an answer.
I mean, I think it's a fairly safe generalization to say that countries that are in crisis produce more interesting fiction and more interesting novels, not necessarily better, but arguably more interesting, and novels that grab people in a very profound way. It's a silver lining to crisis, in a sense. I mean, I'm sure if people had the choice, they would rather live in a place which was less interesting and you know, more stable and safer and happier. But it is a byproduct. And you know, if you say, if you're comparing it with Indian fiction, there are crises in India too, but they don't necessarily touch people in quite the same way. You could be writing in Delhi and Bombay and be utterly oblivious of things that are happening on the peripheries of the country, and then you'd be writing about different things. And it's quite telling that, say, even within Indian fiction, if you want to, and I don't want to be political about this, but there are very interesting writers now coming out of Kashmir, Indian-controlled Kashmir, and because there is another place where people cannot escape crisis, where they cannot escape conflict, and it gives people a subject who might otherwise be struggling for one. On the other hand, they might also, people who would rather write about love end up writing about war, and there's a loss as well as a gain in that. But it is this country's fate at this point in history to be dealing with a number of different crises, and so that and that crisis infects even those novels that are set abroad. And even though, and you know, there's a writer called Italo Calvino, a brilliant Italian writer. He wrote a wonderful novel called Invisible Cities. And in Invisible Cities, Marco Polo is the main character, and he tells stories to Kubla Khan of all those countries he's visited. And they're very beautiful stories. And you realize after a while that even though he's describing these wonderful cities Marco Polo's met on his travels, the stories are all really about his native Venice. And wherever he writes, and whatever he writes about, he's really writing about his home and what's going on there. And there is an argument that all the writers here of Pakistani origin, or Pakistani-born people who are writing about America, or whether it's Nadim Aslam writing about Pakistani families in England, it's all informed by what's happened right now and what happened when they were growing up. And that is arguably one of the fascinating blessings of Pakistani literature at this point. I mean, hopefully, in an ideal world, things will change, and Pakistani writers will one day have to confront a lack of an obvious subject. It'll all be about the ordinary human dramas which produce wonderful fiction, but aren't interesting in the way that publishers and audiences like.
But isn't interesting, and I want to pose this question to you actually, the concept of the countries in crisis producing more interesting literature is purely subjected by, it's based on what the market wants to read. So if Pakistan is the hot topic and we're producing literature, will it be more interesting because that's what they want to hear about, that's what they want to read?
Well, I do think that Pakistan today is one of the most exciting places to be in many, many different ways. There are some very important issues being decided in Pakistan which will have repercussions globally and regionally. There are stories, a million stories for writers to explore. And you see, I've been to a few, I don't get invited to many literature festivals, but the few I've been to, I feel the Karachi Festival, so for me, had a special significance because of that. And whereas other places, it's just a matter of sort of authors massaging their egos and trying to get more media attention. Here, at least, one feels there's some very important issues which are at stake, not only for Pakistan, but for the future of the world. So I feel that here's a great opportunity for writers from all over the world, in whatever language, to come and explore this place and see the number of different stories that are possible. And I am hoping that this kind of crisis, and I do agree with you to some extent, crisis does bring about change, and in bringing about change, it creates new forms, new innovations, new ways of thinking, not only in terms of the written word, but in terms of television, in terms of radio, in terms of music, in terms of arts in general. So I know a lot of people are quite scared to come here, but those who are not will find this a very exciting environment to create things in, and so in that sense I agree to some extent, but it's not just about crises. There are historical moments in countries, in people's lives, which then give rise to something artistically, politically, culturally. And I think that there is a moment that is happening here, and hopefully that there are writers who will be able to capture those moments and to explore. There are so many different types of issues, social, cultural, religious, otherwise, to be explored for writers. So this is very fertile ground for writers. There's no doubt about that. And what I said about English writing, I think that there are people who are writing in English are doing a great job as well, because they are internationalizing some of the aspirations, the issues that are universal to us all, So in that sense, I do feel that this is a very important place in the world today,
I think this also raises kind of an interesting question, just on a purely sort of empirical basis. And is there right now a flowering of Pakistani fiction? Because we have a group of writers, many of them here at this festival, who've achieved a global reputation in the last few years. So you could imagine, well, that must mean Pakistani writing in English has suddenly exploded. Or maybe it just means people have started to notice it. I mean, it's an interesting question. There have been some very, very good Pakistani writers in English over the past few decades. They just weren't the flavor of the month. And I mean, one of the most depressing things you can do is to sit with publishers as they talk about what they want to do for the next few years. And it's all sort of, what's the next big thing? We had Caribbean literature last year, and then we had Indian stuff, and now it's Pakistan, and then what we need something hot and new and exciting. And you think, gosh, is that really the way it works? I mean, that's so awful. They're just going to drop everything here, and next it's going to be Russians or Chinese or something, and then that'll be it. I mean, on the other hand, I guess it's quite fortunate that one of the things that Pakistan has, and this is a question I'd ask Anya, is that there is a significant number of people writing in this language, English, which is so important in the world. Many more books are published in English than in any other language. And, for example, many more people in England and America have read books by Pakistani authors than by German authors. Very few books written in German are translated into English. There's W.G. Sebald, and that's kind of it in the last few years. I mean, it's much harder for a German writer or a French or an Italian writer to break into this international world and be read by lots of people and be translated, even, or let alone read in the original, than it would be for, funny enough, for a writer from here.
Yeah, I don't know if you're exactly right. I think there have been a lot of translations the last years, also of authors I know who are not Sebald, but yeah, I think this Pakistani literature issue is maybe not. I mean, it is very different from European normal business and literature business, but also I think it sort of just opens up opportunities, because what we have in Europe is we have all the libraries, and we can really go to a lot of, like, we can get all the informations, and we can really open up our focus. And I think it's not only about what is written so far, but also about perspectives. And so what we would need to discuss is maybe somehow an opening of viewpoints, which would require to also think about topics that are actually discussed here, whereas we could maybe think that this is just the first place where they are discussed in such a